Hello and welcome to this Envato Tuts Plus course. I'm Adi Pordila, and in this course you'll learn how to create masonry layouts with CSS. In a masonry layout, elements of different heights are displayed in a staggered way, just like you can see in this example from Pinterest. And this has actually become a very popular pattern in UI design because it allows us to display elements of different dimensions in a grid format. Now, creating a true masonry layout requires a little bit of JavaScript magic as well. But in this course, we'll explore 3 CSS-only approaches that will get us really close. So here's what you'll learn. In the first lesson, we'll take a closer look at the characteristics of a true masonry layout and how you can create one with the tools available today. Then, in the second chapter, we'll explore 3 ways of creating such a layout without using JavaScript. Alright, so let's get the ball rolling. We'll start by explaining what a true masonry layout is all about. That's coming up in the next lesson, so I'll see you there. Welcome to the first lesson of this course, where you'll learn what a true masonry layout is all about and how you can create one with the tools available today. So let's get started. A masonry is a column-based grid layout that doesn't have fixed height rows. In other words, each element has a different height and any unnecessary gaps are eliminated. Now, in terms of UI design, a layout like this has 3 very important technical requirements. Number 1, the elements inside have different heights. The width stays the same, but the height will vary from element to element. Number 2, the elements or grid items are displayed in the correct order from left to right, regardless of how many columns we have. As you can see in this example, we can read the grid from left to right, starting with elements 1, 2, 3, 4 on the first row, and then 5, 6, 7, and so on the next row. And this is actually where most masonry layouts fall short, because they will order the grid items in columns instead of rows. As you can see in this example, the first column contains items 1, 2, and 3, the second 4, 5, and 6, and so on. Now, while this isn't such a big deal in some situations, this type of layout is not exactly true masonry. Finally, requirement number 3. The columns are contained and their number is defined. Ideally, we want to be able to define how many columns we want to use and also contain those columns so they don't overflow outside of the viewport. Now, to create such a layout, you would most likely go for a JavaScript solution because this is by far the easiest method because it requires you to write the least amount of code. Currently, there are a couple of JavaScript plugins that you can use for this. I'm going to mention Masonry here, Masonry.js, and Isotope. These are 2 of the most popular ones, but as I was saying, there are a couple more. A simple Google search for, masonry layout or masonry JavaScript will give you some other results as well. Now, the thing with these JavaScript-powered solutions is that they will use absolute positioning on all of the grid elements, so they can be placed in a masonry format without any gaps. And if that's something that you're willing to accept, then great, go ahead and do that. Now, if you don't want to use JavaScript to create a true masonry layout, then I'm afraid you're out of luck because doing this with pure CSS is not possible at the time of this recording. However, if you're willing to make some compromises, then you can create some CSS-only layouts that are really close to, or that are very close to the real thing. And by compromises, I mean not meeting all three requirements that I mentioned earlier. So in the next chapter, I'm going to show you three methods for creating CSS-only masonry layouts that will get us very close to a true masonry layout, and we'll discuss pros and cons for each one. The very first layout will be created by using multi-column or CSS multi-column layout. That's coming up in the next lesson, so I'll see you there. Welcome to the first lesson of this course, where you'll learn the first method for creating a masonry layout with CSS, and that is by using multi-column layouts. Before we begin, I'd just like to mention that I've already covered multi-column in more depth in this short course on Envato Tuts Plus. So if you want to learn more about this, check out that course first. Otherwise, keep watching this lesson where I'll explain the basics of using multi-column layout and how to apply that to create a masonry layout. So let's begin. I have a very simple demo set up for you on CodePen. Basically, I have a container with a class of C multi-col, and then several divs with a class of post. Each post contains an image, an H1, and some paragraphs. Now, you'll notice that these images are taken from Unsplash, and you can find links to all of these in the lesson notes. But you'll notice that I'm getting images that are different heights. So, for example, this one is 600 in height, this is 800, this is 1000, 1200, 1400, and so on. Now, currently, I added some very simple styling here, and I'm just gonna turn in SCSS here as a preprocessor because it really makes no difference to creating the multi-column layout. It's just to simplify the code that I'm writing a little bit. What you see here are just styles for presentation only. So let me quickly guide you through these. I'm doing a reset on all elements where I'm setting box sizing to border box. Then I'm setting some generic styles on the body, just margin padding, font family, and so on. I'm initializing a counter called bricks, and this is for counting the actual elements that I have on the page, the actual posts. So this is the first one, this is the second one, third one, and so on. Then I'm just setting some styles for the paragraphs, H1s, and on the post itself, I'm setting a nice white background color, some padding, some margin, and I'm using a nice box shadow. I'm setting the images to 100% width and display to block so that they're always going to be resized to match their parent container. And then I'm generating these pink counters with a before pseudo element. And that's all there is to it. Now, how do I take everything that you see here and create a masonry layout? Well, let's introduce multi-column layout. This is actually very simple to use, and I'm only going to use it on large displays, because on small displays like mobile screens and stuff, this layout actually works just fine. But on larger displays, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to say media, screen, and let's set a minimum width of 768 pixels. So here I'm going to target C multicol. This is the parent, the general container for all of my cards, let's call them. And there are several ways you can get started with multi-column. You can set a column count like this. Let's say 3. So that will split up the content in 3 columns, right? Here's column 1, column 2, column 3, regardless of the width of my page. Okay, here it goes to a single column because I have this breakpoint, but other than that, it rearranges the content so that it fits within 3 columns. Now, notice something's not quite right here because the content is broken up. See how a part of this card is showing up here? To prevent that, it's really simple. You just target the element that you don't want to break, and you would say break inside avoid. And that's it. Now, there is no more breaking up of the content. And actually, let me just remove this box shadow because I think it just makes things a little bit harder to see. So as you can see, this approach splits up my content into 3 columns. You can also set a column width instead of column count. So by setting a column width, let's say, I don't know, 20 viewport width. That's gonna create as many columns as it needs to fill up the entire viewport. Here, it's creating 4 columns. But if I change this to, for example, 30 viewport width, it creates 3 columns. So depending on how wide you want those columns to be, it's going to determine the number of those columns. And with multi-column layout, you can also specify a gap between columns. So if I set 2 rems here, it's going to add a gap of 2 rems between columns. And notice that that particular change will give you a different number of columns. Now we have 2 columns, but if I resize this a little bit further, it's going to be 3 columns. So setting column width as opposed to column count will actually give you some flexibility here because it will automatically calculate how many columns it needs. So that's pretty cool. Now this is the first approach, right? Using multi-column layout. Is this a true masonry layout? Well, let's remember the 3 technical requirements. We have items of different heights. Check. Number 2, the items are ordered in rows and not in columns. Well, that's not exactly true because we have item 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So number 2 is not applied here. Number 3, do we have a set number of columns and are the columns contained? Yes, we have. So this approach checks off numbers 1 and 3 of the 3 technical requirements we talked about in the previous lesson. So while this isn't a true masonry layout, we're actually very, very close to one. Now, are there any drawbacks? Well, not really. I think this is the closest we're going to get to a true masonry layout with using just CSS. Even browser support is not a big issue because, as you can see, apart from IE 6 through 9, which, let's be honest, there are very few people still using those browsers nowadays, the rest of the browsers are supporting CSS multi-column layouts. So that's fantastic. I guess the only drawback is the one that we mentioned, that items are not ordered properly in a row fashion. Instead, they are ordered in a column fashion. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. But other than that, I think this has the greatest potential. All right, so that was the first method with CSS multi-column layout, and that's definitely the easiest one we're going to cover in this course, and actually the one that will give us the best results. Now, if you're not happy with how this works and you're looking for other methods, I have two more to show you. The next one is Flexbox, and we'll talk about it in the next lesson. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, you'll learn how to create a masonry layout with Flexbox. Now, contrary to its name, this method is actually the most inflexible of all, but you can still use it in certain situations. So let's begin. Now, I've prepared a simple demo for you. I have a container with a class of C, Flexbox, and then inside a couple of divs with a class of item. Now, some of these divs have a background image applied to them, like this one. Others have a figure with a block quote and a site inside of them. So this is what we currently have. These are all random photos from Unsplash. Now, in terms of styling, again, I just went ahead and wrote some presentation CSS. We're starting with the usual resets, and then I'm just styling the figures, the block quotes, and for the items, I'm actually setting the same counters, so we can see the numbers on each item. And I'm also setting a different color, a different background color for each item. And I'm using the nth child selector to do that. So now, how can we use Flexbox to turn this into a masonry layout? Well, it works very simply with Flexbox, but it has one major drawback. The height of the container needs to be fixed. That's the only way this will work. So I'm going to do this for larger screens. For small screens, I'm going to keep this layout, just like I did with the previous lesson. So I'm going to say media, screen, and minimum width 768 pixels. And here I'm going to target C Flexbox, and I'm going to set a display to flex. So let's see what that is doing. It's doing this. Basically, it will line up all of our items in a single row. Now, to get our masonry layout, we need to make sure these elements will wrap on a new row when they get to the edge of the container. So for that, we can say flex wrap, and we'll set that to wrap. And that will give us this result. Not exactly what we're looking for. However, we can set the flex direction to column instead of row. So now all of the items are again stacked. Not exactly what we're looking for. In order to make this work, we need to set, as I was saying previously, a fixed height on the container. So let's set this to 100 viewport height. All right. So now we're starting to get some results. As you can see, these are now displayed sort of in a masonry fashion, but they're kind of overflowing, and we have this scroll bar here, and we don't want that. So what we need to do is we need to set a different height, a fixed height for all of these items. And actually first, I'm going to set a max width of 10 viewport width on the actual figures, because those were taking up a lot of space. Let me also remove the padding. All right, so now let's set the height. To do that, I'm going to use the exact same principle that I used here. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to say item, and I'm going to paste these in. And let me just quickly go and remove the background colors because we don't need those right now. And what we need to do is set the height to either a fixed value like so, or we can use percentages. Now, before we do that, you might wonder what is up with this nth child 6n. Nth child 6n basically allows us to select every sixth child of the item element, or every sixth item. 6n minus 1 is every fifth item. 6n minus 2 is every fourth item, and so on. And by doing this, I'm able to create kind of a pattern where every sixth item will have a certain height, every fifth will have a certain height, and so on. So for this, I'm going to say 33.333%. So a third. Every fifth item will be 2/3, so 66.666%. Every fourth and fifth item will be 50%. And then maybe we can throw in some quarters here. So let's say 75%, so 3/4, and 25%. All right, so this is what it looks like. This is how you can create a masonry layout with Flexbox. Now, right off the bat, we can already see some problems with it. If you're just going to do images, then this is actually pretty good. But if you're going to put other types of content in it, you might run into issues, just like you can see here. This at some point will get too big for its container and it will just overflow. But again, because we're using background images, they'll be resizing accordingly, and it's actually going to look pretty good. Another issue is that items are not ordered in rows. So we have item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. So technical requirement number 2, if you remember, well, that doesn't pass here. Technical requirement number 1 was that each item has a different height. And in our case, that's true. Requirement number 3 stated that the columns need to be contained. So we have that here, and their number is defined. That is a little bit questionable because the number of columns in our case is dictated by the number of items we have in our markup, right? If I delete, let's say, these 2 items, instead of 5 columns, we will have 3 columns. So this approach fails at technical requirement number 3. However, I decided to show you this because it's actually a pretty cool way of creating an image gallery. I added this extra content so you can see that you can add some content that's different than images, but I wouldn't use this for anything other than an image gallery. But for an image gallery, it's actually pretty cool. But the biggest drawback in terms of styling is that you need a fixed container, a fixed height container, and you need to set fixed heights to all of the items. In terms of browser support, well, this is Flexbox. So whatever browser supports Flexbox will support this type of layout. All right, and that's method number 2 for creating a masonry layout. And even though you need to write a little bit more code with Flexbox, this method is pretty simple to use. Now, for our third and final method, we will be using CSS grid layout. And that's coming up in the next lesson. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, you'll learn how to create a masonry layout with CSS grid layout. And this is actually would be my next choice after multi-column. And as you'll see in a little bit, this method actually has a great potential for creating a true masonry layout. So let's begin. As usual, I have prepared a simple demo for you here. I have a container with a class of cgrid, and inside a few divs with a class of grid item. And each grid item contains a block quote inside. Now, I've also added a couple of different classes to each grid item: short, tall, tallest, taller, and so on. And I've just varied these across my my markup here. And the result is something like this. As for the CSS, I've also added some presentation styles. Really nothing to do with creating a masonry layout. It's just to style these a little bit. And you'll also see that I have these numbers on the top left corner of each item, just so we can see the order in which these items are displayed. Now, to create a masonry layout with CSS grid, we need to do the following. And just like I did in the previous examples, I'm going to do this for large screens only. So I'm going to start with the media screen, and I'm going to set the minimum width at the same value of 768 pixels. So then I'm going to target the cgrid container, and I'm going to set a display to grid. Next, I'm going to set up some columns and some rows. So I'm going to say grid template columns, and I'm going to do repeat autofill, and I'm going to do a min-max of, let's say, 30% and 1 FR. All right, so that's going to create 3 columns in this configuration. And it's also going to affect the height of all of these items, because each item will be as tall as the tallest item in its row. Let's also set some auto rows. So I'm going to say grid auto rows. I'm going to make these 4 rems tall, like so. And I'm also going to set a grid gap of 1 rem, just so I have some spacing between these items. Also, I'm going to target grid item, and I'm going to set its margin 0. That's a leftover from the styles for smaller screens. All right. So now to make this work, all I'm going to do is define the short, tall, taller, and tallest classes to properly size these items. So for short, I'm going to say grid row span 2. And let me just copy this. And that's going to be tall, tallest, or taller, and tallest. Obviously, you can name these whatever you want. So tall is going to be span 3, taller is going to be span 4, and tallest is going to be span 5. All right. And with that, we now have a masonry layout. So if you didn't understand what happened there, is we basically defined our columns and our rows, And we set these classes to give us different heights for these elements. And by doing that, we have a masonry layout. Now, let's put this to the test. Is it a true masonry layout? Well, criteria number 1 was that elements have different heights. So that's checked. Criteria number 2, the items are ordered in rows and not in columns. Well, kind of, sort of. You can see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we're almost there, but not really. Because as soon as I decide to change some of these values, let's make, for example, I don't know, this first one, tallest, right? That's going to change how these items are ordered. So we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So maybe you can get the first 3 items to be ordered like this, but the rest will just be ordered depending on how they're arranged in the page. So on criteria number 2, I think that's a pass. And on criteria number 3, are the columns contained? Yes, they are. And are the column, or is the column number defined? Well, it is defined because we just defined it here, right? So if I want, I can say a min-max 25% of or 1FR and or 20%, and that's going to change to 4 columns. So we are actually controlling the number of columns that are being displayed. So that's check on number 3. Now, the big drawback to this approach is that we need to define the height of the elements ourselves. Unlike multi-column, where the height was undefined, right? That approach worked with items of different heights. So this is definitely not perfect, but it's pretty close. And if the order of the columns is not a big problem for you, then you can successfully use this method to create a masonry layout. Also, if you're not bothered by the need to define the height of the elements first, then again, this is a good approach. Now, at the beginning of this lesson, I told you that this method actually has great potential for creating a true masonry layout, and that's true. Let me show you what I mean. I've prepared a very similar example to what we've seen before. We have roughly the same HTML and roughly the same presentation styles. The only difference is, right here, I'm not defining the height of the items. Instead, I'm just setting display grid, template columns, just like we did before. I'm setting a grid gap, but here is the most interesting part. I'm setting grid template rows to masonry. Now this, in Safari, doesn't do anything because this is a property value that is currently experimental and it only works on Firefox nightly under a flag. There is no guarantee that this will become part of the actual CSS spec. As I was saying, currently it's just experimental. So it doesn't do anything in other browsers than Firefox nightly. So let me bring in Firefox nightly and show you how this works. All right, this is Firefox nightly, as you can see here. And right off the bat, it still doesn't do anything because we need to specify that we wanted to use the new masonry property. So I'm going to open up a new tab and I'm going to say about config. And I'm going to search for masonry. And where it says layout.css.grid template masonry value enabled, let's change that to true. So now, if we'll do a refresh, you'll see that we now have a true masonry layout where the items are different height. They are ordered properly in rows. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and so on. And we also have a specified number of columns defined by this, of course, and the columns are contained. So this is the closest that we're going to get to a true masonry layout with just CSS. The problem is that this is only experimental. We don't know if this will find its way into the official CSS spec at some point, but as far as CSS only solutions go, this is it. All right, so that was method number 3, CSS grid layout, and as you saw, it gets us pretty close to a true masonry layout. I'm not sure if the experimental value that I showed you will make its way into the official CSS spec at some point. I hope it will, but you never know. For now, don't use that in production. It doesn't work except in Firefox nightly. And if you're looking for a true masonry layout, then you should go for one of the 2 JavaScript-powered solutions I showed you, or just some other JavaScript-powered solution that you can find if you do a quick Google. Otherwise, if you're willing to make some compromises, then one of the 3 CSS-only solutions I showed you will get the job done. With that said, thank you very much for watching this course. I hope you found it useful. I'm Adi Pordila, and until next time, take care.